You might think you understand medieval warfare. Gritty battles, knights charging in shining armor, swords clashing, and armies laying siege to castles. It's a dramatic picture, one we've all seen in movies, read about in books, and maybe even studied in history class. But brace yourself. You're about to learn just how far off that image truly is. The Crusader campaigns of the 13th century were far more than just military expeditions. They were carefully planned operations aimed at breaking the spirit of entire populations. These weren't just raids for land or plunder. They were organized campaigns designed to instill fear and break the will of entire communities. The goal wasn't just to conquer. It was to create an environment where resistance seemed impossible. Crusaders used psychological warfare so effectively that even the mere rumor of their approach would send entire towns fleeing in fear. And long before the first sword was ever drawn, they had already achieved victory through terror. Crusader leaders understood that fear was a weapon more powerful than any sword. These men were driven by deeply religious beliefs, convinced that they were acting as instruments of divine will. In their minds, they were not mere soldiers. They were holy warriors with the moral right to bring violence to those they viewed as enemies of God. This belief not only justified their actions, but also gave them the psychological immunity to carry out acts that would have been unimaginable for others. The Crusader strategy was as systematic as it was horrifying. Crusader forces would strike quickly and decisively, often at dawn, catching their enemies off guard. They weren't just looking for land. Their true aim was to create an atmosphere of fear that would continue long after they had moved on. They struck without warning, leaving towns, villages, and cities in chaos. The fear they generated spread faster than the Crusader army itself. It was so effective that the mere possibility of an attack would send entire populations fleeing, scattering, and abandoning their homes before the Crusaders had even arrived. In Lebanon, for instance, archaeologists uncovered mass graves filled with Crusader soldiers from the 13th century. While these soldiers died in battle, what stood out was the evidence of executions after the fighting had ended. These were not random acts of violence. They were methodical acts of terror, ensuring that their enemies had no opportunity for respite. The soldiers didn't just fight. They pursued those who had been captured and hunted them down with ruthless efficiency. What's particularly unsettling about these findings is the methodical nature of the attacks. Crusader forces didn't just fight on the battlefield. They pursued their enemies long after the battle was over. Many of the soldiers' injuries were to their backs, indicating they were attacked from behind, possibly while retreating. This wasn't traditional combat. It wasn't about heroic battles between soldiers. It was about creating fear, pure and simple. These were not just warriors, they were hunters, and this was a key part of their strategy. What made the Crusader raids so effective wasn't only their battlefield strategy. It was the psychological manipulation that took place even before the first sword was ever drawn. Crusaders weren't just warriors, they were a force of nature that turned whole populations into prey. Even when they weren't physically present, their reputation for cruelty spread far and wide. Entire towns and villages would scatter at the mere rumor of their approach, not because they were outnumbered or outgunned, but because they knew what was coming: a history of destruction and violence that had become legendary. Entire populations were psychologically crippled before the Crusaders even arrived. The Crusader strategy was deceptively simple, yet terrifyingly effective. Strike fast, strike hard, and then vanish before anyone could mount an organized defense. The goal wasn't just to conquer. It was to create such a climate of terror that resistance would crumble before it could even begin. It wasn't about territory. It was about spreading terror so deeply that it would outlast the physical presence of the Crusader forces. These weren't just military raids. They were psychological campaigns designed to leave communities in a state of constant fear, long after the physical destruction had ended. This was calculated terror, not random violence. Crusader forces would storm towns with military precision. They struck quickly, but the real weapon wasn't just physical force. It was the psychological aftermath. The real goal was to make sure that the trauma of their raids would live on in the survivors' memories. Muslim chroniclers of the time described the Crusaders as almost supernatural forces, appearing from nowhere, bringing destruction, and then vanishing just as quickly. Entire cities would empty at the news of their approach, and those who remained lived in a constant state of dread. The goal wasn't just destruction. It was to break the will to resist, to leave survivors so traumatized that they could never hope to rise up again. The Crusaders understood that by targeting civilian populations, they could disrupt the very social fabric of their enemies. Women, children, religious figures, anyone who could rebuild a community after a siege became deliberate targets. By attacking non-combatants, they ensured that the social structure of the community could never recover. This wasn't accidental violence, it was calculated. The Crusaders knew that if they destroyed the foundations of society, resistance would be impossible. The terror wasn't just about the immediate violence. It was about the fear that would outlast the attacks. The psychological impact of these raids was felt for generations. Survivors carried their stories far and wide, reinforcing the Crusaders' terrifying reputation. Every story of brutality added to the weight of fear that Crusader forces carried with them. Entire regions were left living in constant fear of future raids. It wasn't just about the violence. It was about the legacy of psychological terror that would last long after the Crusaders left. The Crusaders didn't just aim to win battles. They aimed to reshape entire societies through fear. Modern analysis of their tactics shows that what we see in these raids wasn't just medieval combat. It was an early form of psychological warfare, where the goal was to create fear so deep that the enemy's will to resist would be entirely shattered. Every part of the Crusader raids was designed for maximum psychological impact. From the timing of the attacks to the methods of killing, even the aftermath, everything was planned to keep the target population in a constant state of fear and submission. The true scope of their terror wasn't just in the violence they inflicted. It was in how they systematically reshaped entire civilizations. Crusader raids weren't just about conquering land. They were about breaking the spirit of entire regions. They left survivors in a state of perpetual fear, their societies forever altered by the constant threat of future violence. The Crusades weren't just military campaigns. They were deliberate operations of terror, designed to transform the very fabric of the societies they attacked. The transformation of entire civilizations under the weight of Crusader terror was a psychological strategy unlike anything the world had seen before. The Crusaders didn't just conquer, they rewrote the rules of warfare. They taught the world that terror could be as effective as any weapon, and their legacy would echo for centuries. Their raids were not simply acts of violence. They were systematic campaigns of fear, and the world would never be the same again.